Welcome back. Kim, what do you make of the prospects of an idea like this in a Republican Congress? And you can recall back to the 2016 campaign when many people said if Donald Trump wins this election and gets into office, he will have smart advisors around him. He will have Republicans in Congress. And to some extent, I think that turned out to be the case because that 2017 tax reform was drawn up in large part by people who had been in Congress for a while in Republican circles and done previous proposals under Paul Ryan, people like Kevin Brady in the House, people who understood economics like Pat Toomey in the Senate. And I wonder how many of those folks are still around. And I would point to what happened shortly after President Trump floated this idea of no tax on tips. Here's the press release from Ted Cruz. Senator Cruz and colleagues introduced the No Tax on Tips Act. And his colleagues include Steve Daines of Montana, Rick Scott of Florida, Senator Kramer of North Dakota. And Kim, I mean, Rick Scott has a business career, a guy I would normally think of as understanding these arguments. And so are they just along for the ride here in this 2024 campaign? Or do you think they're really signing up for a bill in 2025 to exempt tips from tax in this way?
Unclear what the fate of these would be. I would right now say it would be a bit of a jump ball because on the one hand, what you say is correct, Kyle, that we've lost a lot of the intellectual leaders that really understood good tax policy on the Republican side. You've now got folks like, for instance, Jason Smith, who's running the House Ways and Means Committee, that's much more open to a lot of these new right ideas, kind of populist ideas that are very much a break from good, smart Reagan tax policy. And you do have some enthusiasm. You would always have those Republicans who would be wary or wouldn't want to break with the president, especially if it was a major initiative. That being said, I would note that for all the talk of this, and even though this is being given a big megaphone by Donald Trump, the vast majority of Republicans who are still in Congress generally still hold to that free market, broad-based tax policy view. And there has been pushback, for instance, in the House and the Senate, some real pushback among Republicans against plans, for instance, to increase the child tax credit and other giveaways and handouts. Also, I think another check on this would be the cost. At a certain point, if Donald Trump actually cares about, for instance, making his 2017 tax cuts permanent, which is also a singular feature of what he's been campaigning out there, there isn't going to be enough money to go around to do all of these things without just some eye-watering budget deficit numbers. And, you know, the problem with some of these carve-outs and special handouts is that they're spendy and you can't necessarily make the case that they are going to generate growth or any income or return as well, too. So that's going to require people make some hard choices. And I would argue at the moment that the bigger majority of Republicans in Congress would be more keen, for instance, to make those tax cuts permanent than to start adding more complications into the tax code.
But those political calculations are part of what makes it so hard to predict what the next president's term in office economically might look like. I would point to an op-ed that is in the Journal by Jason Furman, former economic advisor to President Obama. And his conclusion, here it is that Mr. Trump's ideas on tariffs, the budget, and the Federal Reserve pose a much greater risk to the economy than Ms. Harris's. And he walks through some of those policies. And part of his calculation seems to be that the Senate is more likely to be in Republican hands. And so Republicans are more likely to be able to run the table on policy than Democrats will be. Another one of these documents that's been floating around is from Moody's Analytics. It suggests that a Democratic sweep of the White House and the Senate would be better for debt as a share of GDP, holding it lower than it would be if there's a divided Congress or if there's a Republican sweep of Washington. But Alicia, part of the difficulty of making these calculations is it depends on how much you trust the policies that the campaigns are putting out, their bullet points, their discussions on the stump about what tax policy they want to put forward on tips and on overtime and so forth. and how much you don't trust, particularly Kamala Harris's reassurances that she's no longer interested in doing Medicare for all or grand policy ideas like that. But if you have the case of a Democratic sweep of the Senate, I can only imagine that pretty soon after Kamala Harris is sworn into the Oval Office, we'd be having a conversation again about whether a Democratic Senate is going to pick up a Medicare for all bill.
The credit raters should be dismissed. Their opinion should be dismissed automatically, right? They, for one, recall back in 2007, 2008, they were rating, the mortgage-backed securities, AAA. And well, we saw how all that turned down. They're repeatedly wrong on things. They're late. And they have a bias toward tax increases. So they think that the tax increases largely have a bigger deficit impact, or rather reduction in deficit, than spending cuts. So they are very favorable. I mean, you saw that in Europe, their quote-unquote austerity pledges that they were really pushing for countries to increase taxes. So I'm inclined to dismiss whatever Moody's says. Now, on Jason Furman's piece, I think one of the things I found most frustrating with his logic was that, well, we should take seriously everything that Trump is proposing on tariffs, but we really shouldn't take seriously what Harris is saying on, for instance, her price controls, quote unquote, price gouging, or rent control proposals, because she would need a Democratic Congress to enact these. Well, actually, the administrative state under Biden has shown tremendous resourcefulness in imposing its will via regulation, finding various laws or loopholes. For instance, recall the student loan forgiveness, the eviction moratorium, which actually did start under Trump, but they extended it and extended it again. And based on these vague laws, and don't count out the possibility that Harris would be able to do a lot of it, accomplish a lot of what's on her agenda via regulation. Now, on the spending side, if you have a Democratic sweep, I think the Build Back Better plan is just the baseline you should be going off of. That was their plan, and they almost passed, recall, when they had Democratic control of all of the House and Senate and the White House in autumn 2021. It fell apart over some last-minute wrangling with Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin over the tax increases to pay for that. But there was on the table a lot of the Biden agenda, 44%, which would have raised, by the way, the capital gains tax 44%. It would have included the corporate tax increase 28%. It would have included actually a wealth tax, or rather a tax on unrealized capital gains. On the spending side, there was a new family paid leave program entitlement. There was a child care entitlement, universal pre-K, an expanded child care tax cut. And that was essentially predicted to cost $5 trillion at least over a decade. It didn't include Medicare for all, but did include dental and vision plan care. I'm not sure Democrats will go all the way for Medicare for all, or just try to tighten and increase regulation of private industry and private health plans, and basically do what they plan on an installment plan, essentially make these insurance companies into public utilities, which would essentially achieve what they want to do with Medicare for all, and at the same time maintain these quasi-private businesses that they can continue to kick around and perhaps raise taxes on.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim will give you the last word, but the challenge in these campaigns, since we know we are going to have a Senate that is going to be very closely divided. It could be 50-50, could be 51 Republicans and 49 Democrats. If it's 50-50, of course, the tiebreaker is whoever is holding the White House and the vice president's office. But the challenge of figuring out what the next 4 years might look like is it depends on that, and it depends on the ambitions of the two parties. And by the way, that was also true in the past. Remember, President Biden campaigned in 2020 thinking that he would probably have a Republican Senate and divided government, and that it was those two Georgia runoffs that flipped the Senate to Democratic control and allowed him to go after this Build Back Better agenda and pass the Inflation Reduction Act in ways that I think were very hard to predict if you were sitting in the middle of the 2020 campaign trying to figure figure out what a Joe Biden might do in office.
Yeah, I think this is the importance of what Alicia just said. You have to look at the party's ambitions and their makeup. And my issue with that, firm in peace, is, first of all, it took at face value everything Kamala said, even though she's been very cagey about what she would do. And I think there's good reason to be a bit skeptical of her campaign promises. But also, here's the blunt reality. We were just talking about how Republicans have different views on taxes on tips or overtime taxation. But one thing that's absolutely clear is there is an enormous section of the Republican Party in the House and the Senate that are deeply concerned about the level of our federal deficits and debt, and are determined and really want to do some cutting. They want spending control. We're on the verge right now of a potential government shutdown, and that's because there's a sizable chunk of House Republicans who say that a proposal to keep spending steady at the moment with a continuing resolution is irresponsible and that we need deep cuts now. And so they're not going to vote for a CR. Now, I don't think that that scenario is going to happen. But my point being is that at least there are Republicans who care about spending restraint. I could count on one hand the number of Democrats who have any concern about the deficit whatsoever, whose only interest in being in Congress is spending more money. And by the way, not on things like productive taxation reform that could actually help the economy, but on pure out wealth transfers that are going to have no economic upside or benefit. And by the way, a couple of those who I can count on my hand, they're leaving Congress, like Joe Manchin. And so if you're looking at these things and you're making a bet and you're remotely concerned about our level of spending and who's going to do more damage to the economy, you have to remember that past and the stated interests of both parties as you go to the election box.
Thank you, Kim and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.